So our next speaker this afternoon is Isabel Ortigosa, and she's going to be talking about the effect of foreign language in fear extinction. Isabel, are you able to share your screen now? Okay, thank you very much. Over to you.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm presenting a study called The Effect of Foreign Language in Fear Extinction. My project is still in progress, and it's basically looking at how the use of a second language or a foreign language modulates emotions. And an important point to start is the fact that feelings and emotions are something we can never ignore. In some way, we feel the need to express them or eliminate them. It's not surprising then that one of the main tools to release this emotional cluster is through language. And language and emotions are closely intertwined. We receive words and phrases as representation of thoughts and emotions. That's been one of the core ways of communication. Likewise, language itself is capable of arousing emotions in listeners and readers. We all laugh or cry with books or poems. But there are other factors influencing. The way we experience and handle emotions varies considerably, and importantly, the way we experience emotions depends very often on contextual factors. Beyond its content, words can depend on factors such as the context in which they are learned or expressed. And a different language context could be one of these factors. In recent years, a good number of studies have tried to explore whether the psychophysical and cognitive impact of linguistic material with emotional content is constant through the languages that a multilingual person knows. Most of the studies carried out for this purpose converge in showing that when multilingual people are exposed to tasks of linguistic comprehension or production in a non-native language, the impact that emotional linguistic material has on a cognitive level and physiological levels is less than the impact of the analog material presented in a native language. For example, we know that reading the sentences aloud in a foreign language decreased the effect of the emotional charge of the sentences, demonstrated by physiological measures. Or something very emotional like reprimands or insults also elicit a lower response and are perceived as less emotional in a second language. This is called the foreign language effect. Here, foreign language refers to languages acquired later in life, learned in an academic context, outside the familiar and emotional environment, implying a lower proficiency in comparison to the native language. And this effect opens a new path in which people are less biased or influenced by their emotions. But what is the reason? Well, I won't really answer that here. The reason is not very clear yet. The processing of information in a non-native language is supposed to be slower and less fluent because of a higher cognitive load, and in consequence, it elicits a lower emotional reactivity. We understand here emotional reactivity as an individual's duration or intensity of the affective arousal. And here, a foreign language would work as an instrument to communicate information in a different way with lower emotional reactivity. And this tool can be used to approach other fields in which high emotionality evokes difficulties to progress in the process, like psychotherapy. The use of the foreign language in psychotherapy could allow patients to verbalize highly emotional material because it could create a feeling of protection. And this foreign language effect could help people cope with emotional events. Many psychological treatments involve the use of language in the process, and within these psychological treatments, one of the most used and effective in the context of cognitive behavior therapy is exposure therapy. This strategy involves repeated confrontation with the fear stimuli. The extinction of fear, in which this study is focused on, grounds this technique. It consists of the conditioned stimulus previously paired with an aversive stimulus, repeatedly presented without being followed by the aversive stimulus, resulting in a decline of the conditioned fear response. It's also important to highlight that the inhibitory learning model of extinction provides a curious framework for the mechanisms behind it. It tells us that the process of extinction does not involve erasing the previously learned association, which rather is left intact, but creating a new one superimposed to the first one. So given the critical role that language plays in exposure therapy and the effects that foreign language use can have on emotional reactivity, we assess here whether the foreign language context can be used to alleviate patients' anxiety when facing their fears, reducing such emotional reactivity. So here we test whether the foreign language effect influences the extinction of fear based on the preceding results in the conditioning of fear in a second language context. This previous work sought to explore the potential benefit of the use of a foreign language in aversive conditioning in the acquisition process of fear. The paradigm used in that experiment was an instructed fear paradigm, which involved fear conditioning without the need for direct presentation of negative stimulation, simply through verbal instructions about the aversive or threatening potentiality of a certain type of stimuli. So this instructed fear paradigm was administered to a group of participants divided into two conditions, native and foreign. The conditioning involved pairing the possibility of receiving an electric shock with neutral stimuli, blue and yellow squares. So the verbal instructions worked as the conditioner, as the threat. The emotional response was measured using pupil dilation and skin conductance. And something important, to overcome the potential effect of cognitive load associated with the foreign language processing, the critical issue then is comparing the difference between the magnitude of the psychophysiological measures between the neutral and the threat condition, and not so much whether the pupil dilation or skin conductance levels per se are larger in one language than in the other, since this may reflect just differences in the cognitive load. In this previous experiment, the results show that the difference between threat and neutral in the foreign language context was lower. So the linguistic context influenced the verbal conditioning, being weaker in the second language. In the present study constitutes a second experiment following this previous one. The objective is that this experiment replicates the same experimental paradigm used in the previous one, manipulating the linguistic context in order to explore whether the psychophysical response to aversive stimuli differs between contexts of native and foreign language in extinction as a consequence of the emotional distance associated with foreign language. 58 students were recruited from the university. The inclusion criteria were Spanish as mother tongue, relatively proficient level of English, less than 1 year living in an English-speaking country. The participants completed several questionnaires prior to the experiment, including a self-perceived knowledge of English and an anxiety questionnaire to examine their levels of anxiety. So this study used an instructed fear and instructed extinction paradigm with three parts: training, conditioning, and extinction. The stimuli presented consisted of blue and yellow squares, with one of the two categories associated with the possibility of receiving an electric shock in order to have linguistic production, native and foreign. The task that the participants had to conduct was a countdown from 10 to 1 out loud, with the numbers appearing on the screen superimposed to the squares at a pace of 1 second. During both acquisition and extinction phases, the physiological measures collected were the diameter of the pupil and the participant's galvanic response through a skin conductance recording system. Then, before the experiment, all participants go through a short training phase in which they complete 2 neutral trials in both languages with the purpose of reducing the stress levels associated with the use of a second language. In the conditioning phase, the electrodes corresponding to the electric shock were attached to the wrist to accomplish VR conditioning in the participants, even though no shock will occur, in order to achieve this aversive conditioning. They were informed in their native language that one of the squares was associated with the possibility of receiving from 0 to 3 electric shocks, while the other one remained as a neutral stimulus with no shock. All the participants had to do the task, the countdown, in their native language, Spanish, so that the conditioning was in the same language context for all the participants. The association between color squares and thread was counterbalanced so that half of the participants had the blue squares as the thread and the other half had the yellow ones, the yellow squares. The language context started in the last phase, in the extinction phase. The instructions were given either in the native language or in the foreign language, depending on the experimental group. The participants were informed in the corresponding language that there could be no shock in this phase, and the electric shock electrode was removed. The language context assigned in consequence included the spoken and written instructions, the interactions between the researcher and the participant, and the task. The task was exactly the same as the one in the conditioning phase, with the exception that the countdown was either in Spanish or in English, in accordance with the group. Each condition of thread and neutral squares consisted of 10 trials of 10 seconds each, 20 trials in total, displayed in a randomized order. As these are preliminary results and the electrodermal response seems to be less clear and needs deeper exploration, we are only focusing on the pupil size response here. And these figures represent the pupil dilation results in the conditioning and the extinction phase. Yellow points correspond to the thread and blue points correspond to the neutral condition. On the left, we can see how the thread condition shows a higher arousal or emotional reactivity in the acquisition of fear, so it worked. And then in the extinction, to discriminate the effect of the second language over the native language regarding the thread, we use the statistical index previously employed for acquisition of fear. And according to this index, we see a greater pupil dilation associated with the thread. Here, okay. So we see that the thread is higher than the neutral stimulus in the foreign language condition. The difference is bigger in the foreign language condition than in the native one, and it's only significant in the foreign language context, actually. Importantly, the main effect of language context was clearly visible in the pupil size response, showing a generally greater dilation change overall in the foreign language condition than in the native language context. As we said, this bigger change could be due to higher cognitive load in a non-native language. And extinction in the percentage of change of the pupillary response over the 10 trials, we can see the extinction line decreasing during the 10 seconds. This could be the number 10, and this could be the number 1 on the screen during the countdown. That's what the numbers that the participants saw. So generally here, extinction is represented by this decline of the fear response to thread and neutral stimuli. The blue and yellow squares is the decline of arousal. So the more time passes, as you can see, the line is declining, the weaker is the fear response, and the more effective is the extinction. The difference is not very visible here between these two conditions. And All this means that even if there was a response change in both native and foreign conditions, the difference between them was shorter in the foreign language context, illustrating that the response to the threat was proportionally stronger in this condition, which means that the emotional reactivity was higher. And well, we expected the confirmation of the foreign language effect diminishing the emotional reactivity more effectively in terms of arousal and pupil responses in the extinction of fear. But here, the higher emotional reactivity, according to the index in the foreign language context, seems to indicate that the effect works differently. So the context of foreign language seems to have diminished or attenuated the effect of extinction through the instructions, making it less effective. The participants learn more effectively in the native language that watching the squares after being told that there will be no shock was not dangerous. In the foreign language, it seems that these new instructions were harder to learn or to integrate. This could indicate that cognitive processing is making the instructions in the second language harder to process as well, and consequently, they influence the process of extinction in a weaker way. And these results are based on the idea of understanding the extinction process not as erasing the previous learning, but as a new learning superimposed to the previous one. So here, the new association learned in extinction via verbal instructions will show that according to the index, the new learning during extinction is stronger or more effective in the native language. Of course,
5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Of course, this is being tested in a laboratory context, and it should be studied in a more realistic clinical environment in the future. Yet we do not assume that findings from foreign language learners will generalize to simultaneous bilinguals or to immigrants learning via immersion. Those groups need to be independently studied. It's also important to point out that given that the use of a foreign language impacts the processes behind fear extinction somehow, it's possible that it may also affect the return of fear after a while or in a different context. And to conclude, the foreign language effect is there, still lessening the effects of verbal instructions, diminishing or attenuating the effect of extinction. We report the first experimental evidence regarding how the use of a foreign language does not really facilitate fear extinction when it's verbally communicated. So the foreign language effect should be further explored in other areas or other techniques within the field of exposure therapy or in psychotherapy in general. And hopefully these results will settle an open door on the field of foreign language effect and the effects and uses it may have in different areas to make use of its potential benefits. And that was it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Isabel. Thank you very much. So we have a question from Mikhail Paradowski asking if you used an independent measure of L2 proficiency. As you said, the participants were relatively proficient. And if so, was there a relationship between proficiency and performance?
Well, all the participants were recruited from university, and we knew beforehand that they would have more or less the same level of English, but we also they had also to complete a questionnaire, and they had more or less the same level of proficiency. And what was the question? The relation between proficiency and?
It was proficiency and performance.
Yeah. As far as I know, more or less the studies in the same field are always with people with they don't have a high level of proficiency. They learn the language late in life in an academic context, not at home when they are children. So all the references I have, at least, are from this kind of bilinguals. And I don't really know if you are, I don't think if you are a proficient second language speaker, this foreign language effect will have any effect, because the cognitive load will be different and the mechanisms behind it will be different. It will probably, it wouldn't work probably, or it would be very different.
Great. If anyone else has any questions, then please do put them in the Q&A. I won't see them if they're in the main chat. I'd like to ask if you have any thoughts or any plans for the next stages of this research, and whether you've thought much about when you'll start to find clinical implications, because obviously at the moment it's quite abstract, but you must be looking ahead to clinical utility of what you're looking at.
Yes, there are actually so many diseases in which you can use this effect. I was thinking about phobias, for example, or post-traumatic stress disorders, which are anxiety-related disorders with fear, and foreign language effect could be applied here as well to decrease the levels of anxiety in patients, and probably for future research. This would be interesting disorders to check. And also regarding the extinction of fear, it could also be tried in clinic population, not only in the academic area, but with people with fear or phobias to something. We can use the extinction as well and see if it works the same way than in this experiment or in a different way. There are so many things to do.
There's a follow-up from the first question, asking if the participants were relatively proficient, would we expect the same effect in highly proficient bilinguals, e.g. translators?
I don't think we will expect the same effect. I think the effect will be lighter, like softer. Actually, there are some examples. I remember that Freud had patients with people coming from, soldiers coming from war, and they preferred the use of their second language, which was probably more proficient. They prefer the use of the second language to talk about traumas and things like that. And probably in proficient people, it will work, but in less. I think it will be a lighter effect.
And we've got a question from Pearl Lung, saying, building on Mikkel's question, do you know the frequency of LX use of the participants?
The frequency of?
I think so. Is that the frequency of the language use of the participants?
These participants were from the philology, they were studying philology, so they were listening to English every day in class, probably not at home, only in the academic context. They had to speak and to listen to English every day, at least 5 days a week, but it wasn't their familiar language. So it was only in the academic context, as far as we know, yes. And we know that they never lived in an English-speaking country. So their connection to an English context was very limited.
Thank you. Oops, suddenly got questions pouring in. So Megan Driver asks, sorry, I'm not sure that I understand this question, but I'll read it and tell me if you understand it. Would you expect similar results with other emotions in NL versus FL, such as the extinction of anxiety, or in building positive emotions and resiliency to negative or arousing emotions?
Very good question. Because sometimes there is this problem that fear is very confusing, and you can be thinking about fear, but it's actually anxiety or even disgust in some disorders like phobias. And it's very difficult, I think, to delimit what emotion you are measuring in research. But I definitely would like to delimit these emotions and say, okay, this is the level of fear, and this is the level of anxiety, this is the level of disgust, for example, in phobias or in post-traumatic stress disorder. And that would be something definitely very interesting to look at, the different emotions. And these kind of emotions, the negative ones, at least.
Great. And we've got a question from Louise Rolland, saying thank you for this very interesting presentation. It would be interesting to compare simultaneous bilinguals and longer term migrants, as you say. And she'd like to know, have you thought about people who have negative emotional associations with their second language for political reasons, etc.? And she's mentioned her own research, which is relevant to this. You can see the comment later in the chat.
Thank you very much. I will have a look for sure. Yes, that would be very relevant to this research, to compare the different kinds of bilinguals. As I said, I think the lowest is your proficiency, the greater is the effect, but that would be something to check. So I don't know if there is some research like that. That's what I think, that depending on your proficiency, the effect would be lower or higher. And the second question, what was the second question? She has two questions.
Have you, I think you've just answered this. So there was a point on comparing simultaneous bilinguals and long-term migrants. And then have you thought about people who have negative emotional associations with their second language?
No, as far as I know, no, there are no, well, you know what, I think it depends on how people learn the second language, because some people have the second language becoming the first language, and now they prefer using their the first language to talk about emotions, and then the second one. I'm talking about examples I see in my daily life, but difficult to answer, I think. It depends on many factors.
And we've still got 3 minutes. I think there's time for at least one more question. So Zhaolu Li has asked, would it be better to make patients participants rather than college students?
Yeah, totally. I think that's probably going to be the next step, to check the same in clinic participants, in people with some disease, probably one of these phobias or post-traumatic stress disorders, but that would be the relevant step, I think, the most ecological research. This was just like the first step, and that one would be the relevant second step. So yes, I think